picture a scenario that probably strikes a very specific chord of dread in your chest.
Oh, I think I know exactly where this is going.
Yeah, you probably do. So you are standing in a room full of people. Maybe it's a corporate retreat, or maybe it's just a social gathering. And you've been asked to perform a task that you have absolutely no idea how to do,
The classic nightmare.
right? Maybe it's singing a solo part in a choir, or attempting to speak a language you've only just started learning. Or, maybe it's trying to navigate some complex, newly implemented software platform right in front of your younger, seemingly much faster colleagues.
And your heart rate immediately spikes.
Exactly. Your palms start to sweat, your breathing gets shallow. There's this very specific, visceral terror associated with being terrible at something new when you are a fully grown adult.
Yeah.
You are just keenly aware of everyone watching you.
And you're hyper aware of your own incompetence.
Yes. Now, I want you to contrast that incredibly stressful image with a toddler learning how to walk. They take a step. They wobble wildly. They completely wipe out, face first, onto the carpet.
And what do?
They laugh. They get right back up. They are utterly fearless, and they're joyful in their incompetence. They don't look around to see if anyone is judging their walking form.
Not at all.
So it makes you wonder, when exactly did we lose that? When did the act of learning become something we were so deeply afraid of?
That shift from the joyful, uninhibited exploration of childhood to the anxious, self-conscious rigidity of adulthood, it's profound. And what we're going to see today is that it's not just a psychological quirk.
It's not just us losing our childhood innocence.
No, it fundamentally changes how our brains operate. It changes how we process information and ultimately how much of the world we allow ourselves to experience. We build this psychological fortress to protect our egos, but that fortress quickly becomes a prison.
And that fortress is exactly what we are going to dismantle today. We're doing a deep dive into the foundational text, beginners. The Joy and Transformative Power of Lifelong Learning by Tom Vanderbilt.
It's such an incredible exploration.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to completely dissect the psychology, the underlying neuroscience, and the actual physical mechanics of learning new skills later in life. We're going to look at a huge variety of disciplines.
Everything from chess and surfing to singing, drawing, and juggling.
Yeah. The goal here is to discover how intentionally embracing what is known as beginner's mind can fundamentally rewire your brain and reshape your life.
It's a fascinating journey because the research challenges so many of the ingrained assumptions we make about aging and competence. We tell ourselves, usually quite convincingly, that we are simply too old to learn new tricks.
Right. We assume our brains have just hardened.
But the neurological data and the real-world evidence from these deep dives into adult skill acquisition, they tell a completely different, much more optimistic story.
So we are going to connect the neurological dots behind why adults struggle so much with learning, why it physically feels uncomfortable.
More importantly, how we can biologically and psychologically hack that system to overcome those hurdles.
Exactly. So for you listening right now, whether you are prepping to learn a massive new professional skill because your industry is shifting, or you just really want to pick up a hobby like drawing or surfing without feeling utterly foolish, this deep dive is going to serve as your ultimate toolkit.
We're going to help you navigate those incredibly awkward but ultimately exhilarating early stages of learning.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the benefits of learning are so obvious, why is it that by the time we hit middle age, the very idea of being a beginner is so repulsive to us?
It fundamentally comes down to what we can conceptualize as the cocoon of competence.
The cocoon of competence. I love that phrasing.
Think about the trajectory of a standard adult life. As we grow up, society pushes us to specialize as quickly as possible. You pick a college major, you start a specific career track, and you spend decades refining a very narrow, highly specific set of skills.
Right. You get really good at your specific thing.
Exactly. And by the time you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, you have built a life where you generally know exactly what you are doing on a day-to-day basis. You understand your job, you know how to navigate your social circles, you know how to drive your car.
You are respected for your expertise, however niche it might be.
Yes. So stepping outside of that cocoon means voluntarily stripping away your hard-earned status.
It's almost like a reverse imposter syndrome.
That's a great way to put it.
Because with traditional imposter syndrome, you are in a position of authority, and your terrified people will find out you're secretly a fraud. But here, you are terrified of wearing what Vanderbilt calls the scarlet bee, The mark of the beginner.
You go from being the person everyone asks for advice.
To being the person who doesn't even know how to hold the equipment properly or turn the machine on. That is a massive hit to the ego.
Precisely. And this introduces a highly documented psychological phenomenon known as stereotype threat. It's a concept originally pioneered by social psychologist Claude Steele.
How does that play into being a beginner?
Well, when you are an older adult trying to learn something new, say a new language or a highly coordinated physical skill like surfing, you aren't just battling the difficulty of the task itself. You are battling a pervasive cultural stereotype that tells you you are past your prime.
That your brain is no longer plastic enough or that your body is too brittle to adapt?
Right. And when you are even subconsciously aware of that stereotype, it acts as a pernicious inner voice. It constantly whispers that it's too late for you.
And that anxiety actually has a real-time effect, doesn't it?
It does. The insidious thing about stereotype threat is that the anxiety generated by it actually degrades your working memory and your executive function in real time. You perform worse, not because you lack the capacity, but because the cognitive load of worrying about the stereotype steals the mental resources you need to learn.
Wow. And the physical manifestation of that anxiety is wild to read about. Vanderbilt talks about this explicitly in the source material when he takes up singing as an adult.
Oh, the singing lessons. That's a perfect example.
He describes how the psychology of embarrassment doesn't just feel bad emotionally, it actually physically hurts. It changes your physiology. He noticed that when he was speaking normally to his vocal coach, his voice was fine. It was resonant, relaxed, confident.
But the second he was asked to sing,
Right. The second he had to step into the spotlight and be a beginner in front of an expert, his vocal cords would literally tighten up.
Yeah.
His voice would drop from a pitch-perfect, confident speaking tone to this terrified, off-key, strained yodel.
it's fascinating. The fear of being bad in public was literally strangling his anatomy.
Why does our body react like that to just singing?
That physiological response is your sympathetic nervous system reacting to a social threat as if it were a literal physical predator.
Like a tiger's in the room.
Exactly. In the cocoon of competence, your nervous system is regulated. You feel safe. When you expose your incompetence to the tribe, evolutionary psychology kicks in. Historically, being the weakest link in a tribe was dangerous.
So your brain triggers a stress response.
Cortisol floods your system. Your muscles tense up, including your vocal cords, and your heart rate accelerates. But this is where the narrative needs to shift. Because while staying in that cocoon feels safe to your nervous system, the research shows it is actually incredibly dangerous for your long-term cognitive development.
Which brings us to a massive, counterintuitive twist on a very famous psychological concept, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Ah, yes.
If you spend any time on the internet, you've probably heard of Dunning-Kruger. We usually hear about it in the context of people who know absolutely nothing about a topic, but are wildly overconfident in their opinions. You know, the loudmouth at the bar who thinks he could coach a professional sports team.
Right, the classic armchair expert.
But the source material highlights a crucial, often overlooked twist in the data. The only thing more dangerous than knowing nothing is knowing just a little bit.
Yes, the data on what we call advanced beginner's hubris is staggering, and it shows up in high-stakes environments where you would least expect it. Well, researchers have looked extensively at medical professionals learning new, highly complex procedures, like a specific, delicate type of spinal surgery. If I were to ask you when the most catastrophic errors occur during a surgeon's learning curve, logic would dictate that it happens on the first, second, or third try.
Sure, when they're brand new at it.
But the data shows they don't. The highest rate of catastrophic errors actually happens around the 15th surgery.
The 15th. Think about that. You've successfully done it 14 times, and that is when you make the critical mistake. That is terrifying for anyone about to go into surgery.
It is terrifying, but psychologically it makes perfect sense. And we see the exact same pattern in aviation. Pilot errors tend to peak not when they are brand new and terrified students, but at around 800 hours of flight time.
What happens at the 800-hour mark or the 15th surgery?
This is the danger of the advanced beginner. When you are a complete novice doing your first spinal surgery or your first solo flight, you are hypervigilant. Your working memory is maxed out. You are double and triple checking every single protocol, every monitor, every instrument.
Because you are acutely aware that you do not know what you are doing.
Exactly. But once you have a little bit of experience, say 14 successful surgeries, your brain naturally starts trying to conserve energy. It shifts the task from active, hypervigilant working memory into procedural memory.
It starts running on autopilot.
You assume you've seen the standard variations, and you stop paying attention to the subtle nuances. You rely on your expectation of how the procedure should go, rather than looking at the raw data in front of you.
And this perfectly contrasts that hubris with the Zen Buddhist concept of Shoshin, which translates directly to beginner's mind.
Shunri Suzuki famously crystallized this when he said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few."
As adults, we think our expertise gives us an expanded view of the world. But the text gives some mind-bending examples of how experts are literally blinded by their own expectations. Let's talk about the London taxi drivers, because that study perfectly illustrates this blind spot.
The London taxi drivers are a classic foundational subject in neuroscience. To get their license, they have to memorize what is simply called the knowledge. It's an intensely complex, sprawling mental map of thousands of London's streets, landmarks, and optimal routes.
Their navigational skills are legendary.
And the physical size of their hippocampi, the memory center of the brain, are unparalleled. But researchers wanted to test the limits of this expertise. In one experiment, they asked these super proficient drivers to navigate a completely fictional town, a virtual map simulation they had just been introduced to.
And they failed miserably.
Completely. They performed significantly worse than ordinary people who didn't have any navigational expertise.
Why? Because their brains were so densely hardwired to the specific rules of actual London.
Exactly. They couldn't adapt to a new set of rules. They tried to apply London logic to a non-London world. Their expertise, which was their greatest asset, actually became a cognitive prison.
And there's an even more visceral, somewhat shocking anecdote in the text about an expert's expectation completely blinding them to reality. It's about a family at a funeral home.
Yes, this perfectly encapsulates the danger of top-down processing in the adult brain. A family was at a funeral home, standing around an open casket looking at the body. All the adults, who were rational, experienced, mature people, convinced themselves they were looking at their deceased relative, even though the body didn't look quite right.
Because the brain is an expectation machine.
Right. Because they were in a funeral home, and because they were told this was their relative, their brains used top-down processing to force the visual data to match their expectations. They used all their adult rationalization skills to explain away the glaring discrepancies.
They said things like, oh, it must be the embalming fluid making the face look swollen, or it's the heavy makeup, that's why the skin tone is off.
They were doing mental gymnastics to avoid breaking their expectation.
And then it took a 10-year-old boy walking up to the casket to shatter the illusion. The kid didn't have decades of social conditioning. He didn't have all those preconceived adult rationalizations about embalming fluid.
He possessed a true beginner's mind.
He just looked at the raw visual data and stated the preposterous, obvious truth, that's the wrong body.
It's a striking example. It illustrates how expertise and accumulated life experience cause us to see what we expect to see, rather than what is actually physically there. That 10-year-old was utilizing bottom-up processing taking in sensory details without a filter.
This is why maintaining a beginner's mind isn't just a cute, esoteric philosophical concept to make us feel better about being bad at hobbies. It is a highly practical, critical cognitive tool for perceiving reality accurately.
If you cannot suspend your expertise, you become vulnerable to massive errors in judgment.
So if we accept that we need to dive back into being beginners to keep our perception sharp, we have to know how to actually practice a new skill. And this brings us to an incredible story from Vanderbilt's own journey. He decided he wanted to learn chess.
And he decided to learn it alongside his young daughter.
Right. They were both starting from absolute scratch, square one. But the trajectory of their learning could not have been more different. While Vanderbilt completely plateaued, getting stuck at a bottom-tier online rating of around 100 and staying there, his daughter skyrocketed past him.
She eventually started winning tournaments and even made a national ranking list for her age group.
What was the difference? It wasn't just that she had a spongy kid brain. Right?
Yeah. No, attributing it purely to neuroplasticity is a cop-out that adults use to excuse their own poor learning habits. The chess example is a perfect case study in the difference between mindless repetition and deliberate practice.
As an adult, Vanderbilt fell into a very common, very seductive trap.
He assumed that sheer exposure and logged hours would inevitably lead to improvement. He sat at his computer, playing rapid-fire, low-stakes online matches against anonymous opponents one after another. If he lost, he'd immediately click New Game.
He was hoping that brute force repetition, just playing the game a lot, would magically allow his brain to intuit the deep strategy of chess. He was basically hoping he could just absorb the matrix if he stared at the screen long enough.
He confused activity with improvement.
But his daughter took a completely different, much more rigorous approach.
Exactly. She utilized deliberate practice, which is a framework pioneered by the renowned psychologist Anders Ericsson. First of all, she had a coach to guide her, which provided external feedback. But more importantly, her relationship to failure was fundamentally different.
What did she do when she lost?
When she lost a game, she didn't just immediately queue up the next match to wash away the sting of losing. She stopped. She spent hours analyzing that specific failure. She and her coach went back through the moves to see exactly where her strategy broke down.
So deliberate practice requires isolating specific weaknesses.
Receiving immediate, accurate feedback and consciously working to correct those highly specific errors, it is cognitively exhausting.
Mindless repetition is just playing the game. Deliberate practice is breaking the game down. And the harsh truth is, deliberate practice requires you to stare your failures right in the face, repeatedly.
Which is exactly what we adults, with our fragile egos and our cocoons of competence, hate doing.
We just want the dopamine hit of playing, which perfectly sets up our next major area of exploration. If we want to learn how to learn, we have to look at the undisputed heavyweight champions of being beginners.
We have to look at infants.
Yes, the source material takes us inside Karen Adolph's Infant Action Lab at NYU, and the statistics coming out of this laboratory are absolutely staggering.
The Infant Action Lab is a marvel of developmental psychology. They use motion tracking technology, specialized wearable sensors, and various terrain setups to meticulously track infants who are in the process of learning to walk.
And the sheer volume of raw data these infants collect is phenomenal.
On average, the researchers found that a walking infant takes around 14,000 steps a day.
14,000.
And in the process of taking those steps, they fall down dozens, sometimes up to 100 times every single day.
I want you listening to really internalize that number. Imagine if you were trying to learn to ice skate or play the guitar and you actively, painfully failed dozens of times a day.
If an adult failed that frequently while trying to learn a new skill, they would quit by lunchtime.
The ego damage alone would be catastrophic, not to mention the physical bruising. We would say, well, I'm clearly not a natural at this. I'm hanging up the skates. But for an infant, falling isn't viewed as a failure. They don't have a concept of, I'm not a natural walker.
No, for an infant, falling is simply data collection. It has no moral or egoic weight. And this introduces a critical neurological concept known as prediction errors.
How did that work?
This is how the brain actually learns. When an infant takes a step, their brain makes a subconscious prediction about what is going to happen, how the floor will feel, how much friction there will be, how their center of gravity will shift based on the angle of their leg.
And when they fall.
That is a prediction error. Reality did not match the brain's model. The brain takes that failure, processes the discrepancy, updates its mental model of gravity and biomechanics, and adjusts the motor commands for the next attempt.
So without those prediction errors, learning simply cannot happen.
In neurobiology, failure is not the opposite of learning. Failure is the fundamental required mechanism of learning.
I love that reframing. Failure is just data. But it's not just the frequency of their failures, it's how they practice that sets them apart. If you were designing a program for an adult to learn to walk, you would probably tell them to practice walking in a straight line over and over on a flat surface until they perfected the stride.
But if you watch infants in Adolph's lab, they never do that. They walk in erratic zigzags, they walk on carpets, they transition abruptly to slippery hardwood, they try carrying heavy toys, they speed up, they slow down.
They're agents of chaos.
And that chaotic behavior is the perfect instinctual demonstration of what motor skill researchers call variable practice or interleaving.
Which is a massive stumbling block for adult learners.
Huge. When adults try to learn a physical skill, let's say a golf swing or a tennis serve or even a chord progression on a piano, we tend to use blocked practice. We drill the exact same motion from the exact same spot repeatedly. We hit 50 golf balls with the same iron.
Because we want to lock in what we call muscle memory.
But the research on variable practice proves that mixing up tasks, tools, and environments, interleaving the skills, is vastly superior for long-term retention and mastery.
But why is that? It feels counterintuitive. Why wouldn't doing the exact same thing 100 times be the most efficient way to grease that neural groove?
Because if you practice the exact same swing under the exact same conditions, you are only learning how to solve one highly specific problem. You are using your short-term working memory to just repeat the last command.
But the real world is dynamic.
Exactly. You will never face the exact same golf lie twice. By varying the practice, changing your speed, changing the angle, changing the club, moving from grass to sand, you force the brain to reload the motor program from long-term memory every single time.
You force the brain to abstract the underlying concept of the movement rather than just memorizing a rote, inflexible script.
The infant navigating a carpet, then a slope, then a tile floor, is building a robust neural network that can adapt to entirely new terrains. You are teaching the brain how to solve the overarching problem of balance, not just how to perform one specific balancing act.
That is so profound. The infant is learning the concept of walking, whereas the adult doing blocks practice is just learning a memorized routine. And there's another thing infants do naturally that adults completely mess up.
Goalless exploration.
Yes. When a baby is wandering around a room, they aren't looking at the couch and thinking, okay, I need to get to the couch in 4.5 seconds to optimize my route and hit my daily KPI.
They don't care about the destination.
They are just moving to see what happens when they move. They walk to discover opportunities in their environment.
And this is exactly where adult learners frequently sabotage their own progress. We ruin the inherent joy of the learning process by instantly attaching rigid, ego-driven, product-oriented goals to it.
The moment an adult decides to learn Spanish, they immediately say, I must be perfectly fluent in 3 months so I can put it on my resume.
Or you buy a bicycle and a friend immediately asks, oh, what triathlon are you training for? We tie the activity to a distant, measurable product, and in doing so, we completely blind ourselves to the actual process of learning.
We take something that should be play, and we immediately turn it into work. We corporatize our hobbies.
Exactly, and there is a cognitive cost to that. When you are hyper-focused on a rigid, distant goal, you narrow your field of attention. You become stressed about the gap between where you are and where the goal is.
Because of that stress, you miss the subtle nuances of the skill, the small micro adjustments your body and brain are trying to make in the present moment.
The infant's goalless exploration allows for a relaxed, broad focus attention. Emphasizing the process over the product isn't just a mindful platitude. It is the cognitive state that actually facilitates deep, adaptable learning.
Okay, so we've established that infants are the ultimate learning machines because they embrace prediction errors, they use variable practice, and they play without goals. But I want to look under the hood at what is actually happening in the physical biology of the brain.
The neuroscience of starting over.
Yeah, because a lot of adults use the excuse that their brains just fossilize after age 25, that neuroplasticity just shuts off. But the source material shows it's much more complicated and hopeful than that. We have to talk about the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence.
This is a crucial distinction for any adult learner to understand. We typically categorize cognitive architecture into two main types. Fluid intelligence is your brain's raw algorithmic processing power.
It's your ability to think on your feet, hold multiple abstract variables in your working memory simultaneously, and solve entirely novel problems without relying on prior knowledge.
And the data does show that fluid intelligence peaks relatively early in life, typically in your 20s, and slowly declines from there.
But crystallized intelligence is entirely different.
It is your accumulated wisdom, it's your pattern recognition, your expansive vocabulary, your deeply ingrained knowledge of how the world works and how systems interact. And importantly, crystallized intelligence continues to grow, deepen, and compound as you age.
But the paradox the book points out is that sometimes that massive library of crystallized intelligence actually gets in the way of learning something new.
This is what researchers call the less is more hypothesis.
Right. Kids learn languages or pick up new tech faster specifically because their brains aren't cluttered with preconceived rules. They don't have decades of grammar rules telling them how a sentence should sound.
Adults struggle because our brains are highly efficient, highly opinionated, and constantly pruning out information that doesn't fit our established patterns.
There's an amazing memory test discussed in the text that perfectly illustrates this. The obey eagle versus baby cries test.
Yes, this comes from the fascinating work of linguist Michael Ramscar. He designed a test where he gave younger people like college students and older adults a list of word pairs to memorize.
And what happened?
If you give an older adult a pair like baby cries, they will memorize it almost instantly. Why? Because their massive crystallized intelligence knows that babies and crying have a strong statistical correlation in the real world. The neural pathway already exists.
But if you give them a nonsense pair?
Words that have no logical connection, like obey eagle, the older adult performs significantly worse at remembering it than the younger person.
And if you just look at that raw score, the immediate panicked reaction is, cognitive decline. The older brain is failing to memorize the words.
But Ramskar argues beautifully that it's not a failure. It's actually a sign of supreme localized efficiency. The older brain has learned over decades of reading and listening that the words obey and eagle have virtually zero statistical correlation in the real world.
They don't belong together.
So the older brain, trying to conserve metabolic energy, simply refuses to encode that useless, chaotic information. The younger brain doesn't have that vast statistical map of the world yet. To a 20-year-old brain, all information is potentially relevant, so it wastes the energy memorizing everything equally.
The adult brain is constantly crooning the chaos to be efficient. The problem, of course, is that when you want to learn an entirely new skill, whether it's speaking Japanese or learning to kite surf, that skill is inherently chaotic to you.
It doesn't fit your established patterns, so your efficient brain actively resists encoding it.
It's like your brain has a really aggressive spam filter, and it keeps sending your new hobby to the trash folder because it doesn't recognize the sender. You literally have to force your brain to accept the chaos again.
And according to the research Vanderbilt highlights, the absolute best way to bypass that spam filter and force the brain to rewire is by learning a complex new motor skill.
He specifically looks into juggling, referencing some groundbreaking longitudinal studies done in Germany.
The juggling studies are incredible. Researchers took a group of older adults average age of 60 and taught them how to juggle over several weeks. They took MRI scans of their brains throughout the process.
And these 60-year-olds showed massive brain plasticity. They grew new neural matter at a rate that matched the structural changes seen in a control group of 20-year-olds.
It's a landmark in neuroplasticity research because it reveals a fundamental truth about how the brain manages its physical resources. When you first start learning to juggle, the brain is completely overwhelmed by the spatial and temporal demands.
It has to track multiple moving objects, coordinate both hands independently, and manage gravity.
To handle this, the brain starts aggressively building new neural pathways. The sheer volume of gray matter, the actual physical density of the brain in those specific visuomotor areas measurably increases. Your brain is literally throwing resources at the problem.
But here is the most fascinating counterintuitive part of the study. Once those adults mastered juggling, once they could do it smoothly and it became an automatic procedural skill, their brain density actually dropped back down to baseline levels.
Right.
Wait, so the physical brain bulk shrinks back down after you get good at the skill? Doesn't that mean you lose the benefit?
Not at all. It doesn't shrink in a negative, degenerative way. It becomes highly optimized. Think of it like a sculptor chipping away excess stone. Once the skill is acquired, the brain pares down the gray matter, eliminating the inefficient, redundant pathways, leaving only the sleek, essential neural circuits needed to execute the juggling effortlessly.
So what does that prove?
It proves that the actual cognitive benefit, the true neuroplastic workout that keeps the brain young, happens only during the struggle of being a beginner. It's not about being a master juggler. The act of learning, the painful, awkward act of being terrible and slowly getting better is the high-intensity interval training for your brain.
Once you are an expert, the workout is over.
Exactly.
The struggle is the workout.
Mhm.
That completely reframes the frustration of being a novice. When you are dropping the balls for the 100th time, you aren't failing. You are doing heavy squats with your neurons. You are generating gray matter.
But just like lifting heavy weights at the gym, you can't do it nonstop. You will tear a muscle.
Right. The source material emphasizes how absolutely vital rest and consolidation are to this process. You can't just practice juggling or the guitar or coding for 6 hours straight and expect a linear return on investment.
Absolutely. We often glorify the grind, but biologically, sleep and even just taking short, quiet waking breaks are essential for motor skill and cognitive acquisition.
What happens when we rest?
When you stop practicing and rest, your brain doesn't just power down. The hippocampus, which is deeply involved in memory formation, begins to run a subconscious, high-speed, slow-mo replay of the activity you were just attempting.
It analyzes the prediction errors.
It strengthens the successful synaptic connections and begins that pruning process we just talked about. Your brain is literally doing the heavy lifting of organizing the skill while you are asleep.
Which perfectly explains that phenomenon where you struggle with a complex guitar chord or a difficult passage of text for 3 hours. You go to sleep completely frustrated, convinced you'll never get it, and then you wake up the next morning, pick up the guitar, and magically your fingers just know where to go.
Your resting brain did the homework for you overnight.
But as we transition into the mechanics of skill acquisition, we find that before we can even begin to learn these new patterns, we often have to suffer through the profound agony of unlearning.
Because we don't bring a blank slate to the table as adults.
Exactly. Vanderbilt experiences this intensely when he tries to learn singing with his vocal coach Danielle, and later when he tackles drawing using Betty Edwards' famous methodology, drawing on the right side of the brain.
Unlearning is arguably much more difficult and much more frustrating than learning from scratch because, as you noted, the adult brain is not a blank slate. You are carrying decades of ingrained, highly automated habits.
When Vanderbilt tries to learn how to sing properly, he isn't just trying to hit notes. He brings into the studio all the physical tension, the poor posture, and the shallow breathing habits he has accumulated over a lifetime of speaking and sitting at a desk.
Right. His coach points out that he uses incredible unnecessary muscle tension in his neck and jaw to force his voice out.
To fix this, Vanderbilt is introduced to the Alexander technique, and the core insight here is maddening. The idea is that when a teacher tells us to stop doing a bad habit like stop tensing your neck, we don't actually just relax.
Paradoxically, we use more muscle tension to actively prevent the bad habit from happening.
We tense our muscles to stop our muscles from tensing, which just creates a new, more complicated layer of rigid tension.
It's a physiological catch-22. You are using the same flawed neural circuitry to try and fix the flaw. And this phenomenon results in what researchers call action slips.
With an action slip.
An action slip is when, under conditions of high stress or cognitive overload, your brain bypasses your newly learned, fragile, correct pathways and aggressively reverts to the deeply grooved, automated pathways of your old bad habits.
So the text uses a brilliant sports example with Tim Tebow, the professional football quarterback.
Yes. Tebow had a notoriously flawed, elongated throwing motion. He spent countless hours in the offseason with elite mechanics coaches, completely breaking down his throw and building a new, higher, faster release.
In practice, he looked perfect.
But in the chaos of an actual NFL game with 300-pound linemen rushing at him when his prefrontal cortex was overwhelmed, he would invariably suffer an action slip. His brain would default to the deepest neural groove, and he would revert to his old, flawed, low throwing motion.
The old habits are like a massive gravitational pull. It takes immense conscious effort to reach escape velocity. And it's not just physical muscle memory we have to fight. It's deep cognitive habits, too.
Which becomes glaringly obvious when Vanderbilt tries to learn how to draw.
Yes, he faces massive cognitive biases. When most adults who haven't trained in art try to draw a human eye, the left hemisphere of our brain, the logical, categorical, symbolic side, takes over.
It screams, "Stand aside, I know exactly what an eye looks like. I have a symbol for this. It's an almond shape with a circle in the middle."
And so we draw a flat cartoon symbol of an eye. In doing so, we completely lose the ability to actually look at the person in front of us and see the literal abstract shapes, lines, curves, and shadows that make up their specific eye.
The left brain's categorical knowledge actively suppresses the right brain's visual perception. It's that less is more problem again. The brain is substituting a cheap, efficient symbol for a complex reality.
To learn to draw using Betty Edwards' method, you have to actively unlearn your brain's reliance on symbols. You have to trick the brain.
This is why a classic drawing exercise involves turning a reference photograph upside down before you draw it.
When the face is upside down, the left brain can no longer easily categorize it as a face. It gives up.
And that allows the visual processing centers to finally just see the raw data, a curve here, a shadow there, a specific angle. You have to bypass the intellect to train the eye.
It's a complete rewiring of how you perceive the world. Now, when we look at the physical mechanics of actually executing these complex new movements, whether it's drawing a perfect arc, juggling, or surfing, we have to talk about the Russian biomechanist Nikolai Bernstein and his concept of the degrees of freedom.
This concept is foundational in the field of motor learning.
It absolutely blew my mind when I realized how it applies to everything we do.
Bernstein pointed out that the human musculoskeletal system is incredibly, almost incomprehensibly complex. Just think about your arm. Between your shoulder, elbow, wrist, and fingers, your arm has roughly 26 different directions it can move or joints that can articulate.
In biomechanics, these are called its degrees of freedom.
When you try to perform a complex, novel physical skill, like swinging a golf club, throwing a curveball, or keeping your balance on a surfboard, Coordinating all 26 of those degrees of freedom simultaneously is mathematically chaotic for the brain. It's too many variables to control at once.
So how does a complete beginner handle that mathematical chaos? They don't have the processing power.
When Vanderbilt was struggling to learn how to juggle, his coach gave him a brilliant, slightly comedic piece of advice. Be the robot.
Yes, be the robot. To manage the overwhelming sensory and motor chaos, beginners subconsciously and sometimes intentionally must temporarily freeze their degrees of freedom.
You lock your wrists, you stiffen your elbows, you glue your upper arms to your sides, you hold your breath. You physically restrict your body's range of motion to make the task cognitively manageable.
You act like a stiff, rigid robot, reducing the 26 variables down to maybe 3 or 4.
As you slowly gain competence and those core simplified movements become automated in the basal ganglia, you free up cognitive space. Then, and only then, can you begin to sequentially unfreeze those joints, allowing for the fluid, coordinated, kinetic chain of expert movement.
You literally have to be a stiff, awkward, uncoordinated robot before you can ever hope to be a graceful athlete.
Oh.
It's a necessary stage. And speaking of the agonizing journey from being a robot to being an expert, the source material maps this out using the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition.
Stewart and Hubert Dreyfus outlined 5 distinct stages of learning novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expert.
And I think Vanderbilt's brutal, exhausting surfing lessons in the freezing waters off the Rockaways perfectly illustrate the incredibly difficult transition between the first 2 stages, going from novice to advanced beginner.
Surfing is a brilliant case study. In the novice stage of any skill, you are highly dependent on rigid, context-free rules. You need a simple algorithm.
All right. Vanderbilt's surf instructor gives him a basic checklist on the beach paddle: hard 3 times, pop up in 1 motion, keep your knees bent, look at the shore.
These context-free rules are essential. They give the novice a safe, structured framework to operate within. But the fundamental problem with surfing, and frankly with life, is that the ocean is a dynamic environment of pure chaos. No 2 waves are ever mathematically identical.
You can't just blindly follow the checklist. If you just paddle 3 times and pop up, but the wave is closing out, or the wind has suddenly shifted, or the tide is pulling you sideways, you are going to get crushed. The rule fails you.
Exactly. The rules of the novice are brittle. To break out of the novice stage and become an advanced beginner, you have to learn situational context. You have to start recognizing patterns in the chaos.
You have to know when to apply a specific rule, and crucially, when to break that rule based on the unique, real-time environmental feedback.
You transition from following a static script to interpreting a fluid situation.
And anyone who has tried to learn a language or a sport knows that this transition is not a smooth 45-degree upward slope. It is jagged. It is full of agonizing plateaus and what feels like massive regressions.
The source material describes the trajectory of progress not as a straight line, but as a U-shaped wave.
And it gives this amazing illustrative example from developmental psychology regarding children learning temperature logic to explain why we regress.
The temperature logic test is a beautiful illustration of the U-shaped learning curve. If you take a very young child, maybe 4 years old, and you show them a cup of water that is 10 degrees, and you pour it into another cup of water that is 10 degrees, and you ask them, what is the temperature of the new water?
The young child will intuitively tell you it's still 10 degrees. They just use their basic sensory logic.
But researchers found that slightly older children who have just recently been taught the mathematical concept of addition in school, suddenly start getting the answer completely wrong.
They see you combine the cups, they apply their shiny new tool of addition, and they say the water is now 20 degrees.
Their overall performance temporarily got worse, precisely because they learned something new. They acquired a new, powerful piece of knowledge addition, but they haven't yet learned the contextual boundaries of where that rule applies.
They misapply the rule of addition to the domain of thermodynamics.
Precisely. They are trying to integrate a new, complex variable into their existing mental model, and it temporarily destabilizes the entire system. This is the trough of the U-shaped curve.
And this is vital for adult learners to understand. When you are learning a complex skill, say a new tennis backhand, and you suddenly feel like you are regressing, like you can't even hit the ball over the net anymore, it's often not because you are failing.
It is because your brain is actively trying to incorporate a new complex variable, a different grip, a new hip rotation that is temporarily interfering with your automated routine.
The regression is actually evidence of cognitive restructuring. It gets worse before it gets better.
If you're listening to this and you've recently picked up a new task at work, and you suddenly feel slower and more incompetent than you did on day one. This is what's happening to you. You are in the trough of the U-shape. Don't panic.
But how we navigate that frustrating valley of the U-shape depends heavily on the feedback we receive. And the science of feedback, as presented in the deep dive sources, is super counterintuitive.
In our culture, we usually think of good feedback as a tough love coach yelling at us, pointing out every tiny mistake we made.
But the experts say that is actually a terrible, highly inefficient way to learn.
Feedback is an incredibly delicate double-edged sword. Motor learning research consistently shows that learners actually progress much faster and retain the skill longer when they are given positive feedback on what they did right, rather than receiving a constant barrage of corrections on what they did wrong.
Think about it geometrically. There are an infinite number of ways to perform a complex skill incorrectly, but only a very narrow, specific band of ways to do it right.
If a coach only tells you what you did wrong, you are still left wandering in that infinite space of incorrect movements. Positive feedback, however, acts as a beacon.
It reinforces the specific correct neural pathway, and it provides the necessary dopamine boost, the motivation required to endure the frustration of the U-shaped valley.
That makes perfect sense. Point me toward the target, don't just tell me all the places the target isn't.
But the text also warns that there is such a thing as too much feedback. If you have a helicopter coach who corrects every single micro movement you make in real time, it actually stunts your growth.
You become a puppet. You rely entirely on their external brain to regulate your body.
By doing that, you rob your own brain of the opportunity to recognize a prediction error on its own and self-correct. And as we established with the infants, recognizing a prediction error is the very definition of learning.
Exactly. It's called the guidance hypothesis. If the external feedback is too frequent, the learner uses it as a crutch. To achieve true mastery, you must be allowed to perform the action, experience the failure, feel the discrepancy in your own body, and adjust your own internal model.
Without building that internal feedback loop, you will never be able to perform the skill when the coach isn't there.
Which brings us beautifully to the final major piece of the puzzle, Section 5, the social and emotional dimensions of learning.
Because up until now, we've talked a lot about the solitary brain. But learning rarely happens in a vacuum. Vanderbilt discovers this when he joins the Urban Choir Project. He steps out of his solitary vocal booth and starts singing with a massive, diverse group of people.
And he discovers the absolute biological magic of group learning.
The science behind group dynamics and physical performance dates back to a famous 1898 study by a psychologist named Norman Triplett.
He was observing bicycle races at a velodrome, and he noticed a consistent, measurable phenomenon. Cyclists who raced in groups, pacing each other, rode significantly faster than cyclists who rode alone against a clock.
He called this social facilitation. Humans are profoundly, fundamentally social creatures. We evolved to operate in tribes.
The mere physical presence of others engaged in the same task elevates our physiological arousal, sharpens our focus, and unlocks performance reserves that we struggle to access on our own.
And there's a deeply wired neurological basis for this, right? The source material talks about the action observation network.
When Vanderbilt is standing in the tenor section of that choir, watching the people around him breathe, watching their mouths move, hearing them hit the notes, his brain isn't just passively recording the scene like a video camera.
Far from it.
The action observation network involves specialized systems in the brain, including the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area. It essentially means that simply watching someone else perform a physical skill activates the exact same motor pathways in your own brain as if you were performing it yourself.
You are neurologically simulating the action.
It's evolutionary. It's how we learn to craft tools by watching the elders of the tribe. And modern studies show that if you watch someone perform a skill, and you have the explicit knowledge that you will have to perform or teach that skill later, your brain is primed to absorb that visual information at an incredibly accelerated rate.
You learn by watching, but you learn exponentially faster if you know you are on the hook to execute it. Now, what happens when we apply this intense focus and learning to something highly physical, something tangible?
Vanderbilt goes completely off the deep end and apprentices with a master jeweler. Later, he takes a welding fantasy camp.
He spends agonizing, back-breaking, tedious hours doing nothing but filing a basic brass ring down to the millimeter. His hands are cramped. His eyes ache. And yet, he reports finding the experience incredibly deeply satisfying.
Why does filing a piece of metal feel better than sitting in a comfortable office?
This brings in the work of neuroscientist Kelly Lambert, who coined the concept of effort-driven rewards.
We have to remember our evolutionary context. For hundreds of thousands of years, our survival depended entirely on direct physical labor foraging for food, building shelters, physically shaping tools out of stone and wood.
When we use our hands to actively physically alter our environment, like breaking metal apart at the molecular level with a welding torch, or painstakingly shaping a brass ring with a file, it activates ancient, deeply rooted reward circuitry in the brain.
It triggers the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. In our modern, highly abstract digital economy, we sit at screens moving pixels around. We are largely starved of these tangible, effort-driven rewards.
Lambert argues persuasively that this deficit of physical agency is a significant contributing factor to the modern epidemic of depression and anxiety.
Shaping a physical object literally shapes our mental health. It grounds us in physical reality.
But getting to that point of deep satisfaction requires pushing through the initial frustration. And that brings us to the psychological framework provided by Carol Dweck.
Her famous work on the fixed versus growth mindset is usually applied to intelligence, but Vanderbilt applies it specifically to how we view our passions.
We have this pervasive cultural myth that you find your passion. It's treated like a magical stone hidden under a leaf or a soulmate you bump into on the street.
People with a fixed mindset believe that once they finally find their true passion, the activity will be inherently easy, and it will provide an endless, effortless well of motivation.
So the moment the new skill becomes difficult, the moment they hit the U-shaped curve in surfing or drawing, they throw their hands up and quit. They tell themselves, well, it got hard, so I guess this wasn't my true passion after all.
They use the difficulty as an excuse to exit the cocoon of incompetence. But people with a growth mindset understand that passion isn't found. It is forged. It is developed precisely through the crucible of difficulty and frustration.
You aren't passionate about surfing because it's easy.
Hmm.
You are passionate about it because you survived the U-shaped wave of incompetence, you battled the ocean, and you earned your competence. The passion is the reward for the effort.
Exactly. The effort creates the value. And this leads to a vital, liberating realization for the adult learner. Competence is a thoroughly worthy, deeply satisfying goal all on its own, even if you never, ever reach the level of mastery.
Yes. I want to shout this from the rooftops. The freedom of the dabbler. Our culture is completely obsessed with mastery and optimization. We have this toxic narrative that if you aren't going to monetize your hobby, or if you aren't going to be the absolute best in your zip code, why even bother trying?
But Vanderbilt's journey proves that intentionally embracing beginnerdom, being a proud dabbler, drastically lowers your status anxiety.
Think about it. It doesn't matter if you're the high-powered CEO of a Fortune 500 company in your day job. When you walk into the community choir, you are just a struggling bass singer trying to find the pitch. It completely strips away the ego. It puts you on a level playing field.
And it opens you up to incredible new social connections. The text mentions a 70-year-old swimmer who decided to take up studying quantum theory on the side.
When you are a beginner, artificial social barriers and age gaps vanish. You are united by your shared incompetence and your shared curiosity. You get to completely redefine your identity outside of your career title.
By continuously, intentionally placing yourself in the role of the novice, you maintain a profound cognitive and behavioral flexibility. You aren't just learning how to juggle or how to weld, you are practicing the meta skill of learning how to learn.
And that meta skill, the ability to tolerate the acute discomfort of the unknown, to process prediction errors without ego, and to adapt to new environments, is one of the most powerful predictors of healthy cognitive aging, psychological resilience, and overall life satisfaction.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you go about your week? Let's bring this all the way home.
Making the choice to be a beginner as an adult is going to be uncomfortable. There is no biological hack to bypass the awkwardness. You are going to feel clumsy, you're going to be frustrated, and you are going to be deeply humbled.
But the science is unequivocal. Intentionally subjecting yourself to that exact discomfort is the absolute best way to keep your brain dense, plastic, and young. It forces you to shed your biases. It fosters profound empathy for others who are struggling to learn.
It ensures that you lead a vibrant, expansive life that doesn't just narrow into a tiny, predictable tunnel as you age. The ultimate goal of lifelong learning isn't to become a master of everything. The goal is to master the art of beginning.
And I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over, looking toward the horizon of our culture. We are currently living in an era where artificial intelligence is rapidly automating specialized expertise.
Machines are achieving mastery in countless fields at an unprecedented rate. from writing code to synthesizing medical diagnoses to playing chess perfectly.
In a rapidly approaching future where machines are the ultimate flawless experts, the most valuable and uniquely human skill left might just be our adaptability, our willingness to be perpetual novices. If AI is the ultimate expert, confined to the rules of its programming, then our greatest evolutionary advantage is our capacity to step outside the rules, to joyfully, clumsily, and continuously learn how to start entirely from scratch.
That is an incredible, profound thought to end on. If the algorithms and the robots have the mastery covered, it frees us up to just play in the sandbox of learning. It gives us permission to be human again. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of beginners. Now, do yourself a massive favor. Go out there and fail spectacularly at something completely new today.